So we're doing a special nighttime run here, testing out some new ring light equipment on 775 Alive. Here from my wonderful backyard in Elko.
That's Scott's nice way of saying we're talking about the census, which is not a conversation that I can have sober. So I needed to wait until after I had a drink so that we could have this conversation.
And I need to take my glasses off so you don't have to look at little ring eyes.
So the census, you think it's a big deal. For some reason, it flew completely under my radar, and I think it flies under a lot of people's radar. But we brought up some good points that's worthy of a conversation.
Yeah, and as I've said numerous times, I worked the 2020 decennial census. I came onto the Census Bureau in 2019 as a tribal partnership specialist. So my job was to negotiate access for census teams onto the reservations and colonies here in Nevada, and sort of work with the communities about what they needed to do to prepare for the census. And then since we had nobody here on the ground in northeastern Nevada, I picked up a lot of the rural counties. So I ended up covering for those of you not in the 775, I ended up covering a 6-county area that's about the size of Ohio.
Well, there's a lot of really deep issues that I actually wanted to talk to you about, but unfortunately, you just distracted me. So a quick question. Organizing access to tribal lands, that almost sounds like safety issues. Are there problems with the tribal access, or is it just the fact that they're a completely different nation and you need to officially... It's like almost like a diplomatic mission that sends us into the tribal land.
Well, that's on partnership. So let me back up a bit and just point out. So the census, of course, is in the U.S. Constitution, right? Every 10 years.
Ever since the beginning of our country.
Ever since 1789 in the Constitution, right? So first census was done in 1790. No, there's a long period from 1778 to 1787 or 1789 that isn't really going well under the Articles of Confederation.
Well, so many of our institutions these days have such a shallow lifespan. It's nice to see that some things go back quite a bit.
So one of the things to keep in mind at the census is that it is the largest peacetime mobilization of manpower. So when the decennial census rolls around every 10 years, the Census Bureau actually, over the last couple censuses, have mobilized about 500,000 people. Right, by the time they staff up and do this.
That's wild.
Yeah, I mean it's a huge undertaking.
Do they start that process like a year ahead of time?
Oh no, it's about 5 years. This is one of the
not the census itself, but the hiring.
The hiring. That's what the planning process and everything. This is one of the reasons you're hearing the Trump administration, these arguments about the citizenship question on the census coming back up now. Right now is when they're starting to plan the 2030 census. Yeah. And if you remember, there was an effort here. So Trump comes into office in 2017. He wins the 2016 election and is sworn in 2017. And he wants to add the citizenship question to the census. It gets turned down by the courts. It's not turned down on sort of legal grounds about the citizenship question. It's turned down because it's way too late in the process to go back and try to redo everything and make sure they got the accuracy of the data.
So as it sits, the census does not ask whether or not you're a citizen.
The decennial census doesn't.
Okay, so this thing is a way that we count how many people are in our country. And, to someone like me who doesn't do a lot of thinking, you're way in it. You've done it even as a part of your career path. And but for a lay person, I don't think any of us really stop and think, like, how do we know how many people are in the country? And it's important to know, especially when it comes to tax dollars, things like the education system, how many kids are in a county and how much, per person are we going to allocate? And I just haven't given it that much thought. Like, how do you count how many people? And the census is 500,000 people walking around, knocking on the door saying, who live here?
Well,
right?
Not all.
Oversimplified.
That's a bit. Not all of us were walking around, but no. But remember, the original purpose of the census, although we talk about it now in terms of distribution of federal funds, because that gets an easy buy-in from people. Yeah. Its original purpose was to determine political apportionment for the House of Representatives. That's why it's in the Constitution, right? You've gotten so many representatives per portion of the Constitution. It's now up to about one representative. Since the 40s, we've capped the representatives at 435. Okay. So it's basically one representative now for about every 740,000 people.
Well, and that's another place in my brain I've oversimplified this issue. Right. I thought it's just how we ultimately divide up tax dollars. But of course, how would you know? You have to know how many people in your country if you have a representative democracy in order to figure out how many representatives you need. It makes sense for
Well, and that gets back to some interesting issues, which the citizenship question is part of. Can I do two things
Yeah.
real quick?
So as of right, like we've never asked on any census in the last
No,
200 years.
no, that's not correct.
Okay.
So
It was
that's
on at some point.
no. Well, it wasn't. I don't think it's ever been on the decennial census. But
Okay.
remember, the decennial census, while it's the largest operation the Census Bureau does, they do about 150 surveys regularly, and any type of special stuff that Congress might ask for. The counterpart to the decennial is a survey known as the American Community Survey. And basically, what this was, some of our older viewers might remember when you hated getting the long form census back in the 70s and 80s, where you had all the questions on income. Basically, they separated that out in 2006 as the American Community Survey.
Mm-hmm.
And every year they sampled 2% of American households. So that's 3.5 million homes. That survey does ask a citizenship question.
Okay.
Right. It just hasn't been on the decennial census.
And didn't you say at one point imbecile was a question?
Well, that was back in the night.
An imbecile lived in your household.
Well, and that was, this was a 19th century.
I'm still shocked by.
Well, this was a 19th century. This was a 19th century conceptualization of mental health.
Sure.
And what you're referring to, and by the way, a lot of this information comes from a book called The Census: A Social History by Marian Anderson, which is a really good text. And I'll be talking a lot about her ideas because I read it before I got the job with the census and was really been impressed. In some ways, I think it's a better overview than Dan book just had that recent work a couple years ago called Democracy's Data, which really looked at the 1940 census, but this is a broader overview. But that was the 1840 census, which is quite controversial in its own right because it seemed to show, due to a poorly designed census form where there was a lot of mismarking, that a lot of people of African descent in northern states got recorded as basically imbecilic or not able to work. And what happens, the 1840, we're in the lead up now to the Civil War. And a lot of the Southern slave owners used that census data to argue that slavery was actually better than people of African descent, even though it was based on a poor survey design.
Ooh, that hurts. 150 years later, that still hurts.
Oh, it does. It does. But the apportionment issue, which is at the basis of the citizenship question, of course, there's that famous clause in Article 1 of the Constitution about representation in the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And that says basically the census should be representation shall be based on account of all persons, except those bound, or all persons excluding non-taxed Indians. And what they meant by that was Indians who lived in sovereign states, not bound by labor. And those bound by labor would only count as 3/5 of a person for representation.
So they did not actually count the natives at that point?
Well, they didn't. When they say untaxed Indians, what they meant was basically Native American tribes that hadn't had treaties and weren't part of the United States. So because technically they were sovereign states, which gets back to our question. Yes, I do have to negotiate access because Native American tribes are considered sovereign states nowadays. Mm-hmm. But that's the famous 3/5 clause. When people say, slaves were only considered 3/5 of a person, that was done for representational purposes. And the reason of that, one could argue cynically that, for Southern slave owners, they counted 0/5 of a person, right? By the worst cases. But this was done because the Southern states were afraid that the more populous Northern states would dominate the legislature. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to count their slaves, and the Northern states were like, no, they're not really citizens. We can't count them. So the compromise was the 3/5. Mm-hmm. All right.
So if I can fast forward to the here and now, what jumped into my mind when you first suggested a question of citizenship or not to ask on the census? Well, first of all, I had a lot of thoughts all at once. But in terms of the Trump...
You always do.
I know. In terms of the Trump administration's prerogative and their hyper-focus on illegal immigration, mm-hmm. there is a very strong tether there, I think, because my first thought when he said that predominantly was in political strategy and right. what would he be trying to accomplish with this. And at the end of the day, again, when I'm talking about allocating federal tax dollars, if you are not a citizen, you are not entitled to tax dollars. And essentially, and what we've seen really is a lot of illegal immigration hyper-focused in urban centers because a lot of urban centers and cities are protecting illegal immigrants. So they're safe places for them to go. So you have this big concentration there. They're all going to the school systems. They're all using public infrastructure. Mm-hmm. Now, if you were to look at, say, the city of LA and just count the citizens, the amount of money difference LA is going to get if they can't count their non-citizens in the census is drastically going to reduce those cities' budgets, which is where I see the political strategy really is when it comes to like really gut punching the blue states. It would be doing something like this because it drastically drop the amount of federal dollars that are supplementing those cities.
I think that's a large part of it, but remember,
Yeah, just one slice of it, but that is where my mind went at first.
right? Well, and I would point out, I think you're partially right. So this is the sanctuary, sanctuary city argument
that was what I was searching
or sanctuary state, right? If they're counting their illegals and getting more tax dollars, but remember, we still use it for apportionment, and the best estimate right now is that potentially we could see a shift between states of up to 26 seats in the House of Representatives based on whether you count non-citizens for representational purposes. And remember, the House passed...
I didn't even think of how that could shift. Right. That could actually wind up with some new gerrymandering going on.
Well, that's certainly the Democrat argument. The argument is what would happen now. There's a lot of thinking that really it would be states like California, blue states, that are already starting to lose population for other reasons that would be hit particularly hard.
Yeah.
And so the feeling is out of those 26 states, they could potentially represent a 15 to 20 seat pickup for Republicans in Congress, which would dramatically shift the stuff. Can I say one thing?
Sure.
There's a meme that I'm seeing all over the place on Facebook and everything that says, well, if we didn't count non-citizens on the census, California would lose three House seats and 2 electoral votes.
Yeah.
That is not how the Electoral College works, right? There's no way those numbers make sense. If you lose 3 House seats, you lose 3 electoral votes, right? So I don't know who did that meme, but reread the Constitution. That being said,
I think it's like a representative per every 750,000.
Yeah, it's about 740.
So I think someone was doing some kind of political math saying, if you lost 2 million people out of the state, that would be approximately 3 seats.
Right.
That's probably where that came from.
Well, no, the 740 comes from how they apportion. I tell you, that ironically has been one of the problems with the census, is that there is no clear-cut way to take the total number of people, the total number of each state, and determine a representation formula. That has been a problem from day one. And in fact, one of the biggest blow-ups over that was the 1920 census. They actually don't reapportion seats after the 1920 census because Congress can't agree what the formula should be, which is huge because the 1920 census is the first census where more people are living in urban areas than rural areas. So we go into the New Deal, the Great Depression, and then the New Deal based on representation in Congress that hasn't been adjusted since 1910. Right. And some people have argued that's one of the reasons we're seeing stuff such as this huge emphasis on the New Deal over rural-based projects, rural electrification, TVA. Certainly not the only reason, but there's a misallocation there. And this is contentious. I think New York ends up losing 1 seat, I think, or 2. I think maybe 1 or 2 seats they lost in the 2020 reapportionment of Congress. They lost the 1 seat by 82 people by the time the formula came out. And that's not unusual. These seats are basically being decided by a couple hundred people. And of course, New York's like, so if we would have worked a little harder, because you're never going to count 100% of the people. It's just physically impossible. So if we'd found 82 more people, we could have kept that congressional seat. That's the type of bitterness that goes into.
Well, it's really interesting because on its face, the question of whether you're a citizen should be on the census or not, on its face doesn't seem like that contentious of an issue. But I mean, the more I learn about it, the more I'm like, this is a really critical issue because essentially if you're a citizen, that's an entitlement program. You are entitled to a certain number of things. And if you count citizens alongside non-citizens, then the entire pool is diluted. So your entitlements are diluted by not asking this question. But I take it a step further and say, this thing's an honor system, essentially. You can say whatever on these census forms. I mean, let me ask you this. If they ask you your ethnicity, because you've been trained to do this, and you're clearly white, and you say Hispanic, does that person just go along with that?
Yeah, they have to. And let me do it.
The whole thing could just be mislabeled. And my point is, what non-citizen is going to claim they're not a citizen in front of this census person?
There's a couple factors that go in here, but what I wanted to say is, caveat, I no longer work for the Census Bureau. So, if you have any real questions about this,
but you've been trained. I'm like, what is the training on that?
Well,
like, you're clearly not Hispanic.
So historically, there has been an issue where census takers would classify people by looking at them.
Yeah.
Right. So sometimes, Native Americans, when they start counting them, by the time we get to the 1870s, 1880s, are you a full-blood Indian, you a half-blood Indian? And it's really the census taker that's making those decisions, or what race people go into. That's bad. So they've moved to a self-identification model. You are partially right. There's no checking. But one of the funniest things is, and we went through this a lot, because one of the problems that's going on is, it's one thing to say you're a Native American, but the census has really struggled with being able to capture, how many people with Sioux descent are in the U.S., how many people are Western Shoshone, right? How many are Paiute? There's actually a database the Census Bureau uses where people the stuff they self-identify as.
Yeah.
So, looking with Nevada, we can look at and identify, how Native Americans, but you'd be shocked how many white people put down stuff such as hillbilly, druid. This is all captured in the database because it's how people self-identify themselves.
That just seems absurd. It almost seems like I don't know how valid I would consider. If I was a scientist analyzing this data, I'm like, there's no way to tell if this data is valid.
Well,
I mean, really, and in 2020, my census got dropped off at my door. I filled it out and I forgot what happened, or if I sent it back or something, but I never face-to-face with the census person.
No, and that's,
I just,
yeah, and that's what you're describing is what's known as self-response, and that's what the Census Bureau wants because it's cheaper. Right. So part of my job on the partnership team, especially as a tribal partnership specialist, we had to negotiate stuff, but the broader partnership project is really geared about going out and talking to communities to encourage people to self-respond, because you get better data.
Yeah.
For instance, one of the things you tend to get is a more accurate count of children if people self-respond. Because if a census taker and enumerator shows up at 5:30 at night, somebody's home, they're trying to get the kids fed. They just want the person out of there, forget about the newborn sleeping in the back bedroom.
Yeah.
Right. Ironically, children under 5 are the largest undercounted group in the census, which is exactly the group that needs it. But anyway,
I have a constitutional question.
Okay.
So I still get email updates from the state of Washington about small business laws and rule updates. And occasionally I'll read them, if nothing else, for a little bit of comic relief, because everything that comes out of that state is so draconian in 1984-ish. It's crazy. And so occasionally I'll read them to be like, see what kind of nonsense they're up to. And this last one kind of floored me. And so Washington State just passed the regulations that when you are hiring someone in the state of Washington, it's no longer legal for you to ask if they are legal citizens or not. Further, it is illegal to ask for documentation.
Right. Which puts them in violation of federal law.
Okay. So, besides how outrageous that is, because as a business, you have to choose between following federal law or state law. And if nothing else, you can hone in on the I-9, which is something I have to fill out for every employer, which requires me to ask their immigration status.
Right.
Federally required to ask this. The state federally prohibits you from asking it. I wonder how Washington State's going to treat a census document that asks whether or not you're a citizen.
Well, there's a couple things there, and I was going to make a joke that my employees,
Please do.
my employees hate having to deal with the I-9 issues, and the joke being I'm a single person business. But that being said, that's just a de facto violation, but so is letting immigrants stay. I mean, technically, immigration is one of those issues that's clearly in the Constitution as an enumerated power of the federal government.
Right, but could you see someone like the state of Washington rejecting the census altogether because of that question?
Well, there are Native American tribes that reject it.
Okay.
So some of
I could see Washington, Oregon, California, New York all rejecting the census.
The problem is they can challenge the numbers, but by rejecting the census, they can't do anything.
Well, legally, it would force the census to fall upon the previous census numbers and just extrapolate.
Oh, no, it wouldn't. Why would it?
Because that's the nearest statistic that you could pull on. But if you don't have any data for that year, what else are you going to pull from to allocate funds?
So a couple things. Even though Washington and California and whatnot refuse to support the census, you're going to have people that self-report. It's probably going to be a much smaller number than if they're out there encouraging it.
And how accurate would that be? Because it's not a random sampling at that point.
Right. Well, that's a whole nother issue.
Yeah.
I don't think they'd ever do it because it's too important both for the funding and for representation. I mean, any state that refused to do it, they could challenge the numbers.
I think if they actually were successful in rejecting the census, then they could actually save themselves from this population drain, because I really do think they'd have to fall upon the previous census report.
No, because Congress, I mean, that's a federal thing. So Congress...
Well, if you have no data, you have no data.
But you do have the data.
You have to extrapolate from somewhere.
Yeah, you'd probably extrapolate from like the American Community Survey if it was wildly wrong.
Yeah.
But my guess is you'd have enough where they just say, well, California, you had 3 million less people respond, so you're losing 4 or 5 House seats. And there's nothing California can do about it. They can take it up into court, but it is a constitutional requirement. It's controlled by the federal government, so the states can't really say no. They get into the supremacy cause.
So to get this question on the census for 2030, they have to get it done by the end of this year?
Well,
it's Congress.
No. They do have to be the if I remember right, the decennial questions do have to be approved by Congress and the OMB and everything. There's a multi-stage process, but the biggest problem is, again, this is a huge mobilization. You're talking about printing 330 million. You're talking about printing probably 200 million forms.
So they have to get through Congress this year.
No, not necessarily.
To get on the 2030.
No, not necessarily. Okay. The problem is,
they got 330 million forms.
Yeah, they've got millions of forms, and there's computerized backends for the software. That's what the problem was. It's a logistical issue that the Trump administration ran up into. You can't just decide, okay, we're a year out from the census, we're going to reprint all these forms that we ordered 3 years ago. I mean, it's just an insane. And by the way, there's another internet rumor that Trump is somehow going to order another census with a censorship question so they can redistrict states between 2026. I can tell you that is not going to happen. Yeah. There is just no amount of time. But can we go back to the real legal argument about the citizenship question? Despite your concerns about who's going to answer, and the bigger concern is not that people are going to lie, it's that non-citizens just aren't going to be reported at all. And then we have another sort of data lacuna, data hole. The constitutional language does say all persons. It doesn't say all citizens, it says all persons.
Okay.
Now, why that is, considering when this goes into effect, nobody is talking about federal funding for individual citizens. And in fact, by the time we get to
Do you think the founders use that word on purpose, persons?
Yes, and here's why. Well, let me rephrase that. Marian Anderson thinks they use it on purpose, and here's why. The problem that the U.S. is facing in the late 1780s is the fear that they're going to be invaded by Britain or France or Spain or another colonial power. And one of the reasons they need the census is actually to get an assessment of manpower availability to defend the country. And one of the ways that they had defended the country under the Revolution in the Continental Army was by promising men who signed up to fight for the United States, promising them land in exchange for military service. And by having land, they became citizens. Okay. So part of her argument is they very consciously did it to all persons, not citizens, because what they really needed was an assessment of manpower availability in case they were invaded. Now, what's interesting about that is the legal challenges that the Trump administration is going to face about adding the citizenship question is that the 14th Amendment, which is put into place to guarantee, the 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment guarantees that those African Americans would be former freed slaves, would be recognized. Enfranchised. And it repeats that language of all persons will be counted in the census in the 14th Amendment. So in some ways, it is similar to the birthright citizenship. Can an administrative decision overrule the explicit language in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution? And that's going to be the interesting legal battle that's being fought.
Well, right. But my first, and again, when I said I had a lot of thoughts, my first one, I told you my predominant thought, but then my next thought was, how could other agencies abuse this information? Like, your first thought is like, could ICE use these lists? And then you explained to me that it's not like that. It's aggregate data and they have blocks of information. But I'm like, there are people that extract information from the Census Bureau. Right. Otherwise, why the heck did we do all of it? And like, who are these people getting it and how will they use it ultimately is kind of the issue. But just asking whether or not you're a citizen does not really put anyone in jeopardy or in danger. And I think, I can't really see a legal argument as to why you wouldn't just ask that question. 'Cause
Well,
it doesn't really implicate anything. It's aggregate data.
again, part of it is the concern that non-citizens just won't answer it.
Yeah.
So therefore, you just don't count them at all. And again, if they're going to your schools or whatnot, that's a
And
problem.
that's like, is the question null and void if everyone's going to lie?
But the real problem is, again, there is a historical experience to this.
Yeah.
And the historical experience, well, first of all, everybody, when we start talking about this, people are like, well, I can go to ancestry.com and look up my ancestors' census records. Yes, you can, right?
That's cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the census data is held private for 72 years.
Okay.
So if you have an ancestor that's recorded on the census from 1950 or earlier, you can look them up.
Yeah.
You can't look up anybody from 1960 or later.
That's fantastic.
Now, you can always go request your own census data. And in fact, one of the primary purposes of census data for the individual level is exactly for the naturalization process. People will go do stuff like, request a Census Bureau, like, I need to show I'm here 5 years and it's 2024.
Yeah.
You can request your census records and there's a Census Bureau recording you at this particular location in 2020, which guarantees you were here for at least 4 years ago, right?
Yeah.
But
because you're not able to actually directly tie this to a person, I think it's a perfectly fine question to ask.
It is, but see, again, there's a historical precedent here, and that historical precedent is that census data from the 1940 census was actually used by the government in part to identify Japanese Americans during the internment process in World War I or World War II.
That's what I'm saying. When you're like aggregate data, I was like, as long as it's aggregate and you can't tie specific forms to specific people, it's all good. It doesn't matter what question you ask. But the minute you have an ability as a government to get into that data and start actually picking individuals out, that's where it's a problem.
Right. And that's why Title 13 of the U.S. Code gets passed in the early 1950s.
And that's why I'm like grilling you. I'm like, who gets access to the census data?
Well, and let me explain what we mean by aggregate data, right? So what happens is an agency, say the Department of Education, if it continues, or some other agency, can get a report from the Census Bureau that says, okay, in any town in the USA between Main Street and North Street and between 1st and 10th Street, there's 200 households with an average number of people of 5 people per household, and about 2,000 people within that area that are children under 18 that might be, that's how you base your school planning on. What the Census Bureau will not give out to some place like the Department of Education or another great agency is that, okay, the house at 123 5th Street has 10 people who are all illegal.
Yeah.
Right. That's personalized data versus this aggregate data.
And to me, when you made the example of the Japanese, that to me was the government going in and say there's a Japanese person at 123 Main Street.
Yeah, it's exactly what they did.
What happened?
That's exactly what happened. And that's why Title 13 was passed, which is the one that sets the 72-year requirement and so on and so forth. But the concern is, can that Title 13 be overruled by the U.S. Congress? Theoretically, it can, right? There's also, on top of everything else, there's real fears that this might do something if you get census data, even in the aggregate, that this census tract, which is the basic sort of mapping components, if this census tract is 60% non-citizens, does that sort of mark them out for ICE raids?
Yeah. But, this right here and now, the reason why we're talking about it is because it's in the news, because it is something the administration is exploring and trying to put forward. So you really have to ask yourself, what's this about here in the now specifically? To me, this is about, again, it's a little bit of a scare tactic, because a lot of illegal immigrants are very afraid of especially government people knocking on the door and asking you about your citizenship. And, I just want to make sure it's done legally and constitutionally, because at the end of the day, like I said in the beginning, as an enfranchised citizenship, I'm entitled to so many entitlements. And that entitlement pool gets diluted by people that are non-citizens. And if we can start to differentiate and we can start to figure out a way to just be sending federal money to people in LA that are actually citizens, then LA will have to rethink some of its policies and how it's acting, because it'll have to pick up more of the tab if it wants to be a sanctuary city. And it should hurt a little.
Right.
It really should cost them something. And if there's a chance that, this is another way of tackling that illegal immigration problem, I'm all for it. I just want to make sure, be for goddamn certain that it's constitutional and lawful. Other than that, let's do it.
Yeah, and I
But
think
Japanese guy at 123 Main Street from census data, that gives me pause.
right, and
Because again, it's not about illegal immigration; it's about the integrity of our legal system.
right,
We have to apply it the same every time, otherwise, it's no good.
right. Well, and this is a problem. I think it is legal because again, it's on the American Community Survey, right? The sampling they do every year of 2% of American households. The citizenship question is part of that. Any question that appears on the census has to go through sort of a set of processes to get past the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, right? And part of it is there's got to be a question: can you quantify it? This is one of the issue. There's been a lot of complaints. Well, we need to have a multi-gender option, and one of the things that's really screwing up that argument is what does that question look like?
Yeah.
I mean, what data are you actually collecting here, and how are you categorizing it? But the same question gets back to
I'd be fine with other male, female, other.
Well, see, that's not
anything beyond other. I'm like,
well, and that's what the holdup is that even if you put other down, what does that mean? I mean, what are you choosing for other?
It means they don't identify as cisnormative, male or female.
Okay, but let's look at how census data is used. And I don't
like, it's be like the Facebook thing where it's 55 different categories to choose from. Forget it. But other's fine.
Well,
because it validates the other, but it doesn't make a big deal out of it.
This gets into a question for something you brought up earlier about the ethnicity and race issue,
yeah,
which is really unique. Now, other countries do censuses, and in fact, Britain and France both do them at 5-year intervals. I'm not too sure about other countries, so they, in a weird way, have a much more
race and ethnicity are like sex and gender. Like it's almost like sex is the legal term and gender is more of like whatever you make it, the subjective term.
Yeah, well,
like race is a legal thing and ethnicity isn't.
Well, but that's not that problem is it's even more blurred than sex and gender.
Yeah.
I mean, it used to be sex was just biological.
Well, and we're already asking all these questions about ethnicity, and I think the one change they are making is they're adding Arab.
Yeah. Well, there's a Middle Eastern and Southwest Asian category.
So that's definitely getting added to the 2030.
That'll be in the 2030 census, and it's already been approved for. So you're going to start seeing more forms when they ask if you're white, African, Asian, Native American.
Is there any argument as to why we even ask those questions?
Well, that's one of the problems because this is something that's a uniquely American phenomenon. Now, one could argue that America has a unique racial history, and there is some truth to that.
All my arguments about not having all these gender. Mm-hmm. All those arguments apply to the ethnicities too. I'm like, why are we asking these questions?
Right, and it gets into a lot of weird sort of questions, particularly. Well, I mean, I did an article about this. So you have the Hispanic and Latino. So you have this weird question that, Antonio Banderas would be considered to be a minority ethnic because he's Hispanic by census definition, even though he's from Spain. Very white, very upper class.
Yeah.
Sergio Mendes, the Brazilian jazz artist, bossa nova artist, would not be Hispanic by the census data because he doesn't speak Spanish. He's in Brazil and speaks Portuguese.
No.
Now, he would technically be Latino. So what are we measuring with this? What are we measuring with all this data? And that's a question that's going to have to be tackled as well. But it also...
Well, it always bothers me when people say white people and particularly people like me that are particularly one ethnicity, mostly Irish. It's like, I don't see myself like other white people. Like Irish people are very different. And I would say Italians would say the same, and Germans would say the same, and French would say that. We're nothing like each other. Like, dare tell a French person they're just like an English person. I mean, that's not going to go well. Like, we're all so different, And so I'm like, why do we ask these questions?
Right, and there's the question: why isn't there
white either?
Yeah. Well,
I'm Irish.
This is an interesting question because one of the things it has to go through is not only how do you categorize the question, but there's also the question of does a government agency that's requesting this have a legal justification to know this, right? Yeah. So, you're never going to see on a census question something like, what's your bank account numbers? Who do you bank with? Because there's no legal justification for the government knowing that on a census form, right? But going back to the sex versus gender thing, there might be a justification for the government knowing, for instance, in terms of sex, what are we looking at 10, 15, 20 years down the road in terms of prostate situations or breast cancer situations. I mean, breast cancer is male, but cervical cancer, right? And that is biologically determined, and you can see that there's a government argument for perhaps knowing that information that a gender question with 73 different identities isn't going to
Yeah,
answer.
I was going to say you could just pull that information from the hospital. So wait a minute, HIPAA is a pretty tight little
Right.
thing to crack. So yes, you're right. Government would have to
Right.
pull health statistics other ways.
Right. Well, and it gets into how all this is used. We were joking earlier. One of the questions that, again, older people probably remember was the long form census. It used to be about 1 in 6 households during a decennial census got what was known as the long form, right? Where you had like all these questions about your income, and the one everybody hated and couldn't figure out why the government.
It's like jury duty. You just like randomly got the
just
short straw, and you're like, you got the long form.
You got the long form. That's why they separated that. But one of the questions for years on it was how many bathrooms does your household have? And people, this was the joke. Why does the government need to know how many bathrooms? Well, this actually comes out of the 30s and 40s when municipal or regional water systems are being developed for like Tennessee Valley Authority. And the problem is trying to determine water usage in an area that crosses various jurisdictional boundaries. So by putting the question on the census, you can know that an average bathroom uses so many gallons of water per day, and you could get an estimate of a region of what the water use. Yeah, it's sort of an indirect way to get at some really interesting planning data. The question I think we're having is a lot of this racial categorization that has been added to the census form, particularly since the 60s. I think there's a feeling it might no longer be needed. It might not be telling us the issues we need to know about.
Yeah, and I mean, and then to even consider gender on top of it, it's already too much, in my opinion, legally. I'm like, and again, this is just whatever they say.
Right.
So the veracity of the data it still kind of makes me, I don't know what we're getting from it, but I suppose on such a big, massive level, 330 million, that you're probably going to get something out of that. But I mean, everybody's into gender politics and identity politics, and everyone wants to claim they're some rare ethnicity and blah blah blah. And like, how would we even know how people are actually answering these things?
Well,
do people like resent them so much that they just mark what they're not supposed to?
And some do. Some do. I mean, one of the interesting things I'll have to say about working in rural areas, which are, shall we say, known for their distrust of the federal government.
Yeah.
You initially there's a lot of pushback. People, local governments that I'm working with, likely don't want to have anything to do with the census. It's too political. And this will go on for months.
Yeah.
And then, we're a month out from the census, and I go give an update at a county commission meeting. And they're like, well, it is in the Constitution. I guess we had to encourage people to do it, right? It's just, some of it's posturing. But it is an interesting dimension in the fact that the self-identification issue is not the best solution to this problem, but it's the best one we have without getting into having somebody go, okay, you claim you're African American and Native American and Asian. I don't see it. I'm just going to mark you down as African American, which is how this used to be done. And that's sort of the problematic.
What would be interesting is with AI, its computational power. There's so many ways to measure population, and there's really no exact way to do it. It's so funny. We've been talking about this for hours. I'm like trying to figure out how do you count people, and every way I came up with it, I was like, oh, but then, there's no exact way to do it. But I bet AI could put enough pieces together to get a more accurate representation than what a census bureau would.
Well, but
like it could search Facebook, it could look at profiles, it could, cross-reference all these things, and then I think it could probably get down to the actual numbers.
I utterly disagree. I just, well, I mean, part of the
I'm convinced AI is taking over. I find a way to sneak it into every conversation.
No, I mean, this has been discussed, is that, for instance, some of the pushback against census is, why can't we just pull this data off the Social Security database? Well, Doe showed how inaccurate that might actually be. But there's also, the question, why can't the IRS just report this stuff? Why can't?
Well, and then if I were to take a deep dive on this, I would look at how do other countries count their population.
Well, it's a very interesting field, and there's a whole field of study for it.
Probably much easier in China because,
actually, I think China has less idea of how many people they have because they have a lot. They have a larger of
city people, but the rural
they don't. Yeah. Turkey ran into this is one of
their best interest not to count them.
Yeah, this is one of the stories that the Census Bureau statisticians like to tell when we were doing our training. Turkey was a great example because Turkey got all on into doing a census. I don't know when this was, but they declared they were going to have make it a national holiday. So they're going to have Turkish Census Day. Everybody's going to stay home and wait for the enumerators to come. Well, a holiday. Everybody took off to the lake, so they didn't actually get a good count, right? So this is the type of weird stuff that goes in sometimes when you're doing this stuff. It's a very tough issue.
It's tough in Australia too.
Uh,
Especially, I mean, coastlines might be really easy, but as soon as you get inward, they probably have no idea how many people live on the interior.
well, I think it'd probably be a little better just because Australia's population is so small.
Mm.
It's barely 30 million. I mean, it's a small country.
Yeah.
Right.
And then of course I was like DMV records. Like there's all these ways. I'm thinking this is how you count people, and it's like actually no, that the DMV doesn't catch everybody either. And like residency, states have residents, and they file. I mean, they get utilities and stuff like that, and I'm like, how much of this stuff requires documentation and names, and where can you make up enough pieces to go get an ID card? And
right, and this is, I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
it
and
really is.
And it's not new. I mean, this has been so the idea of counting populations really is a Renaissance era idea. Like so much in the Renaissance, the Italian city-states start playing with this in the early 16th century. Most European countries start trying to introduce censuses. Britain tries to do one in the 1750s, and the population just refuses to be counted. That's where the Americans pick up the idea.
Well,
now, by 19th century, they do it.
France and England has illegal. Well, I don't say it's not all illegal immigration, but they have a massive amount of Muslim population and African too, I believe.
Yeah,
they take the boats across. That.
Yeah, there's a lot of taking the boats across.
So I mean, like Italy, think of that cross through.
And Italy has a lot of problems.
They must have a hard time counting how many people are theirs and how many are just passing through, or traffickers.
And it's pushing a lot of it's really pushing a lot of the, in my view, what's a growing huge ethnic problem in Europe.
Yeah.
That I fear is going to become very, very violent before long. But I think it's a very tough question to answer, and it gets back to why are we counting people to begin with?
Yeah.
Right. We talk about cutting funding, but one of the biggest victims of this is going to be school funding. And is it right to take funds away from a 5 or 6 year old who was brought here illegally and make them suffer? Right. So it's some tough issues.
And why can't you take data from IRS filings?
Well, and again, IRS filings isn't going to cover everything. There are some people not required to do IRS filings, right?
I think if you're below a certain threshold of income, it's like 19, 20, 20,000, 24,000, you don't have to file.
Right, and particularly if you're retired.
Yeah, so there's a different threshold for
retirement. Yeah. And, this gets into a whole range of issues and how many people don't file IRS returns.
And then you have, of course, all citizens have a social security number.
No.
So.
No.
What do you mean no?
That's utterly incorrect.
What?
Yeah.
How can you be a citizen and not have a social security number?
Because it used to be it was really only the 1990s before most states would automatically start transferring the birth certificates to the federal government to get a social security number. There's a lot of people who don't have social security numbers because, if you were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s in rural areas, a lot of times when my daughter was born in 1990, there was a separate form to get her a social security card. It wasn't done automatically through the state. The parents had to fill out the form. And particularly when you get in the tribal communities, for instance, who are American citizens since 1924, sometimes they don't report this data to the government for social security numbers because they're not really tied into the system the same way.
Can a Native American apply for a social security number?
Yeah, of course they can. Okay. And technically they're supposed to sign up for selective service, but again,
it was more automatic than that.
Well, it probably is now. Anybody
going into the future, couldn't that be a source of census? Like
it could potentially.
We have this many people that are citizens in this country.
Well, but it's not
just calculate the difference.
So remember the model that we use for the 2020 census is we want to count the right number of people in the right place. That's the other side of the coin. And that's one.
I got 10 people in my house. They're all visiting from Michigan.
Right. Well, no, but a good example, two good examples of this is colleges. Should college towns be able to count their dorm populations towards our citizenship? And the same thing with prisons. A lot of states, including Nevada, require the census to record prisoners that might be in like the state pen there in Lovelock in their last known district back home. And part of this comes out of debates like in New York.
Meaning they have to fill out their census information as if they were still living back home. Oh,
Right.
that makes sense.
Well,
Yeah.
it does, except, what if you're serving a life sentence and that last address, you haven't been there for 25, 30 years? Doesn't make any sense to do that. But
No, that does not.
But this is the problem that came out of New York because
Do you see how complex this is? I
Oh,
didn't
yeah.
realize. It's a bit of a can of worms. Once
Oh,
you
yeah.
opened it up, I was like, why are we talking about census? Once you're like, holy crap, this is a big issue.
Well, and it's really hard to know. And one of the things, I brought up and tying this back in because this is a podcast about the 775 in rural Nevada. One of the problems we deal with is that so we have a decennial census, but it's once every 10 years. So how do you track change in between that? Well, that's what the American Community Survey is supposed to do with the Census Bureau. If you have a population less than 100,000, doesn't consider the 2% sample size to be accurate. So any area less than 100,000 people, which is rural Nevada communities, they use what's known as a 5-year estimate. So it'll take 5 years worth of census data and sort of run back through this model based on the last decennial census to determine where your population is.
Yeah.
Here's the problem with that. So right now, the last data we have was from 2023, right? Which means if you go back 5 years, rural Nevada still has population data from 2019 pre-COVID included in that. And it's not the deaths, but as you know, we've had a huge influx after 2020 of people moving in, particularly from California into rural Nevada. That's not being captured in this sort of census data. And this is one of the things that causes these big surprises when you get to the decennial. All of a sudden, all Elko County, which the Census Bureau says, it's only 57,000. It could quite be that we're well over 60,000 by the time we get to 2030.
Yeah.
Because the sampling model's wrong.
Well, and California is in for rude awakening after 2030 census.
Right.
Oh, they're going to have such a big retraction, and they're already so overbloated in their debt. Oh, my gosh.
Right. And not to mention, they're going to lose a lot of that political representation. And what does that mean for
that means I got 5 years to convince my brother to sell his home in California.
That's between you and your brother.
Yeah, I got 5 years because after that, the market's going to tank.
So,
anyways.
So a lot of fun stuff. So,
citizenship question or not?
Yeah.
That is the question.
Let us know your opinion. Go ahead and shoot us an email at info@775alive.com. Until then, I'm Scott Gaborski.
And I'm Crystal Newton.
See you around the 775.